Hello and welcome to Diplomatic Channel this week. I am Amarachi Ubani. 1 week since the referendum in Crimea, Russia has already begun integrating the peninsula. People there are already turning in their Ukrainian passports for that of Russia's, and Russian flags have now been hoisted at 189 Ukrainian military units and facilities in Crimea. The EU has accused Russia of pre-planning this move, but according to Russia's ambassador to the EU, the reunification had not been pre-planned, but was the end of what it called an abnormality, which had lasted for 60 years. The United States, having imposed sanctions on Russia's main leaders, has ruled out sending U.S. troops to Ukraine, which is going to head to sign that long-awaited deal with the European Union. Meanwhile, NATO is worried about the growing number of Russian soldiers on Ukraine's eastern border.
Russia's actions have indeed surprised the international community, but it seems to have left them with few options as to what actions to take to punish President Putin for invading and overtaking Crimea by what they feel is a stolen referendum. The Russian president has rebuffed the calls for sanctions, but how much of it will be left out in the cold in the international community? While Russia has taken over all of Crimea's military bases, the U.S. Air Force warns that it may have its sights on another ex-Soviet republic, Moldova.
The force that is at the Ukrainian border now to the east is very, very sizable and very, very ready. You cannot defend against that if you are not there to defend against it. So I think we need to think about our allies, the positioning of our forces in the alliance, and the readiness of those forces in the alliance, such that we can be there to defend against it if required, especially in the Baltics and other places.
Germany's finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, said on Sunday that the European Union was united in its readiness to improve sanctions on Russia if the standoff over Ukraine escalates, and that Moscow had much more to lose than the West. German companies are worried the sanctions could push up their energy prices if Russia decides to restrict gas supplies and deprive them of an important export market. Leaders are arriving at The Hague for the G8 summit, and Ukraine is expected to top the agenda.
What happens in Ukraine is distracting attention.
The G7 is to consider a collective response to the crisis during the talks. In the meantime, interim President Alexander Turchinov says he's ordered the withdrawal of armed forces from Crimea. Just 2 naval ships and a single police base are still flying the Ukrainian flag, though Russia's defense officials earlier said that the tricolor of Russia had been hoisted at 189 Ukrainian military units and facilities in Crimea. Moscow's annexation of Crimea on March the 16th came after protesters overthrew pro-Kremlin President Viktor Yanukovych.
Well, what's going on between Russia, Ukraine, the United States and the European Union only reminds us of the period just after the end of the Cold War, when both sides continued their show of force for who was better. Analysts believe the tensions surrounding the Crimea have further degraded relations between Russia and the United States. The U.S. and its allies thought the tension would all end at the negotiating table, which is why a series of warnings came from all parties opposed to the Russian takeover. Moscow, however, has shown it is not afraid of sanctions or repercussions and instead pushed ahead, signing the declaration annexing Crimea backed by the country's parliament. Now, as with all things in international politics, there are actions and counteractions. One of them is the sanctions imposed by the United States and the EU. Will they bring Russia to its knees? One of the questions I asked our guest this week, Professor Kayode Shiremekun of the Political Science Department at Covenant University in Otta. All right, Professor, thank you for joining us on Diplomatic Channel. Professor, Russia has officially annexed Crimea, much to the discomfort of the United States and the EU. But it really seems that there's nothing that these powers can do about it.
Thank you very much, Amarachi. There are several dimensions to this issue. And one thing that struck me as I observed all these events is that if one is not careful, one's attitude is likely to be conditioned by what you get to read. On one hand, one is saying, I'm reading reports about what you can call Russian aggression. On the other hand, I'm also reading reports about what some people have called Washington's hypocrisy, in the sense that if you look at the first one, what has happened has been likened to a kind of a throwback to an earlier era in which Hitler occupied some territories in Europe on the basis of the fact that those living there they were Germans. And we all know what this led on to, the Second World War, horrific consequences and the like. And some people are thinking along that line too, that what Russia has done is in fact to evoke images of that era. But we have to think of something, and that is that when you are talking of international politics or foreign policy, every country has its own interests to protect. And those interests, of course, cannot be seen in isolation. They also run counter to other interests. Specifically, Russia's interest in this case run counter to Washington's interests.
Russia, of course, is already occupying major bases, military bases in Ukraine. How important is Crimea to Russia?
Well, Russia's interest in Crimea lies in the fact that there are Russians living there. And to that extent, what she has done is to make what can be called an irredentist move. The first has to do with that irredentist move, that these people living there, they are Russians, and to that extent, there is that commitment on the part of the Russian state. Having said that, well, we also have to appreciate that at the moment, Russia under Putin is laboring under what we can call some form of nostalgia. Nostalgia about a greater past that was part of Russia's heritage. And one way or the other, in the post-Cold War era, Russia has more or less been cut to size. So to that extent, one is seeing that kind of resurgence on the part of Russia, a desire to play big again, to be among the big boys. And this might be one of the reasons. But having said that, I think if you look at what Washington is doing, Washington too is trying to protect its own interests. But Washington's interests in this particular case, they are much more, they are not as primary as America's interests, in the sense that Crimea is not in America's backyard. Crimea is in Russia's backyard, and to that extent, she has to be more concerned, she has to be much more spirited. In fact, I read somewhere when Washington was, in fact, posturing on this particular issue that, as we speak, America too also occupies a piece of Cuban territory. And so when you look at all those things, particularly in its comprehensive context, what you see is a case of Russia's national interests, primary national interests, clashing with America's secondary national interests.
So would you say that, annexing Crimea was a major victory for Russia?
I don't want to put it in such terms because that's too absolute. I see it more in terms of Russia more or less reclaiming part of our lost glory, trying to, as it were, be one of the great powers again. And like somebody said, when she was even admitted into the G8, she was like a poor cousin of that group. And now she's trying to more or less exert herself with a view to fulfilling those historical memories and aspirations for the Russian nation. And what I see in all of this is that I see Russia protecting her national interest. I see America too trying to contend that. This is a lesson for the Nigerian political elite. That what is Nigeria's own interest? Are we in a position to protect such as Russia has done? Because we need to bring this discussion home. It is not just an academic issue.